Hi, Shane Morris here. Have you noticed the subtle lies that dominate this cultural moment? Lies like, all you need is love, you are the boss of you, or live your truth. Well, these popular slogans convince us that our true north is found in us rather than in God. But the compass that spins back to us will always lead us wandering in circles. In her latest book, Live Your Truth and Other Lies, Elisa Childers provides the Christian response to these cultural lies, an accurate vision of God's reality and His world. For a gift of any amount to the Colson Center in August, we'll send you a copy of Live Your Truth and Other Lies, so you can learn to discern between popular truth claims and biblical truth, and help others to do the same. To request your copy, give today at colsoncenter.org/upchildersresource. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. There are moments in all of our lives at one point or another that make us aware of knowledge we forgot we had or that we had suppressed. A sunset, a flower, a symphony, the face of a child, a painting, a near-death experience. C.S. Lewis said that a young person who is an atheist and who wishes to remain a sound atheist can't be too careful of his reading. I'd say that a young atheist can't be too careful of where he walks, who he talks to, the music he hears, or the love he allows himself to give and receive. Each of these experiences in their own way can function as something more powerful than a logical proof of God's existence. They remind us of something that deep down we already know about who we are, about where we live, and about the duty and desperate desire within each of us to give thanks. Poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning put it well in these famous lines: "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God, but only he who sees takes off his shoes." I want to unstrap our sandals today with a very special guest who, as they say, needs no introduction. Social critic and author Dr. Os Guinness has just written a small but powerful book called Signals of Transcendence, Listening to the Promptings of Life. It's a collection of stories about men and women who encountered a higher reality and were forever changed, and an invitation to all who have ears to hear to listen up themselves. Dr. Os Guinness, welcome back to Upstream.
Well, thank you, Shane. What a wonderful introduction. I wish I'd come across that quote myself that you just used.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to talk about the title itself. Signals of Transcendence is itself a kind of arresting phrase. What's the origin of that phrase, and what does it mean?
Well, I first came across that in a book by Peter Berger back in the 1960s. He introduces the idea. People have experiences which are so profound in their lives that they first puncture whatever they used to believe and point beyond it to something else which would need to be true if the signal is as meaning as it appears to be. And so they become seekers, searchers, looking for a deeper meaning for their lives. I loved his idea, and I've been intrigued. We actually hoped to, he was my mentor, my tutor, and I hoped we would write a book on it together, but sadly he died before we could do it. And so this is my attempt, 10 stories of people who experienced his signals of transcendence.
You draw a pretty sharp contrast between signals of transcendence and more traditional logical proofs or apologetic arguments. Why are these signals so spontaneous and individual and unpredictable and in some ways unreproducible? No two people seem to have the same one.
Well, if you think for a minute, Shane, no one is argued into a belief just by argument alone. And certainly not in the biblical way. It's much more Greek than it is a Hebrew idea. So I think the idea of the signals of transcendence, the way life speaks to us, you rightly used things that are intuition. We know that we know them, although we don't consciously know them in our full rational mind. So stories speak in a far deeper way than arguments. Now, I personally think that many of the arguments for God, the so-called theistic proofs and so on, they don't actually work. You can always say at the end of it, so what? Some of them are very ingenious and brilliant, and you're more impressed by the arguer than by the argument. But I don't think that's the way in which people meet the Lord himself. It's much more existential and encounters, just as no two people can know each other unless each one moves to the other. Well, the same is true of faith. You can never just argue that God is there and then meet him. No. You have to meet the Lord, and signals are one of the ways people start the great search.
I love the story in the Gospels where, and I'm forgetting which disciple it was. I got to go back and reread it. But Jesus actually says to one of them, I heard you, I saw you beneath, it was a fig tree, I believe it was, right? Nathaniel. Yeah. And so he's alluding to some special meaning or experience or prayer that Nathaniel made, and that immediately upon hearing that recognition, he says, this guy is who he says he is. This guy is the real deal because he heard my prayer. And of course, this has been dramatized in various ways, but it's a type of experience that occurs again and again throughout church history. And the most obvious example outside of Scripture is Augustine's conversion, where there's this moment in the Confessions he tells of hearing a child's voice saying, take up and read, tole lege, and to anybody else hearing those words, it would have sounded meaningless. There would have been no meaning attached to it. But for him, it was a signal of transcendence. There was this special meaning attached to it that he should take up the Scriptures and read them. And of course he did. But the thing that's interesting to note about that is it only had meaning because of what God had done in his life prior to that, because God had been working on him, and because those words broke in upon him as a signal. They were experienced uniquely by Augustine in a way that it wouldn't have been by you or I.
No, you put that brilliantly, Shane. You've obviously got a book of your own in your heart.
A few. I'll have to work on them in the coming years. But you give a number of synonyms for these signals of transcendence. So synonyms like the prompt, the trigger, the catalyst, the intuition, the intimation, the alarm bell, the hole torn in life. I think my favorite is the old Celtic idea of the thin places, areas where the barrier between the material and the spiritual worlds are kind of thinner, and it feels like you can encounter those realities more readily. What do these all have in common, and what led you to realize they're actually describing a similar phenomenon?
Well, Peter Berger had another phrase talking about our modern world. He described it as a world without windows. We're rather like the prisoners in Plato's cave, that early parable. In other words, the unseen for modern people is unreal. Now, if you think for a moment, for most people in history, whether they were Jews and Christians or pagans or whatever, the unseen was not unreal. In fact, the unseen was more real than the seen, and they understood things as basic as farming and business and sex in the light of the unseen world. But a feature of our modern world, the unseen, is unreal. So we're living in this world without windows, and many people have a very myopic view of life. And the signals crack that open. If you think of Plato's cave, the one prisoner escapes from the cave and sees the sunshine. But of course, when he comes back to the cave, he's considered a madman to people who only know the inside of the cave. So this idea of the signals is especially important in our Western and our modern advanced world.
It's almost as if the Western imagination has always had a kind of captivity to the material, that in the West, we've always approached things in a very rational way, even before materialist philosophies really became mainstream. And we've needed that ability to notice or to break out of it for a moment and see what's beyond. Because if you think about Eastern philosophies, they're almost all transcendence, right? It's like transcendence is so complete that you're stuck in it. You're in this cycle of karma and reincarnation and so forth. Or even Eastern Christianity has more of a sense that the transcendent is imminent, that it's right there. But in Western Christianity and in Western thought as a whole, going back to Plato, long before Christianity, it seems like there's this need to break out. What do you think is behind that? And then how does it come to a head in the modern world especially?
Well, biblically speaking, there is a greater reality than the seen world and the material world. Now, materialism's half right. We don't want to reject it in terms of Gnosticism and some airy-fairy idealism. No. our Lord became a human being, material, and so on. So we do value the material, but not just the material. And there's a world beyond, and I love that. You think of Elisha when his servant was panicking at the armies of the gate of the city they were in, and Elisha says, Lord, open his eyes. And he saw the horses and chariots of fire. So I often go to, say, Asia, Korea, or Singapore, or Africa. Many of my African friends, things like healing, supernatural healing, are as natural as going to a doctor in the West. And many of the churches have gifts like that are very obvious. But in the Western world, we've drowned it out. In fact, many Western Christians, I would argue, are almost atheists unawares. They're functionally atheists. They live in Peter Berger's world without windows or Plato's cave. We need a massive, this is one of my arguments towards the end of the book, we need a massive awakening right across Western civilization. We need the Word and the Spirit to break in on us and to understand there's a far greater reality than our consumer society and so on allows us to know.
What role does wonder play in all this? Because you emphasize the loss of wonder that's taken place in the modern world, how we don't readily dispose ourselves to be confronted by greater grandeur, either in the natural world or in the arts or in philosophy or in scripture itself. Where does that figure into our modern deafness to signals of transcendence? And then how can we dispose ourselves toward wonder, open ourselves to it again?
Well, wonder is obviously incredibly important. Even in, say, secular circles like philosophy, it used to be well understood that wonder is the birth of philosophy. You wonder, something catches your attention, and then you immediately want an explanation, and you move from attention to an explanation, and the result is philosophy, which is simply good thinking about thinking, exploring all the wonders of life. Now, obviously in our modern world, we've drowned out a huge amount of wonder because so much is man-made, artificial. It doesn't create wonder. And then, of course, as we grow up, you think of kids are filled with questions. Why this? Why that? And parents answer them, and then they run out of time to answer all the questions. But as we grow older, we stop asking questions, which is a tragedy. So questioning, curiosity, wonder is incredibly important. But it's also important to say wonder sounds positive, which it is. But some of the signals of transcendence are horrific and things that stun people in a very different way. So that there's a great variety in the signals.
I want to talk about distraction as well, because that's one of the major barriers to receiving these signals of transcendence that you talk about. That, in fact, you use the phrase weapons of mass distraction to describe modern media and the effect it has on our senses and our imagination and our ability to just contemplate and pay attention to the world around us. Obviously, we all feel the distraction. We all kind of nod in agreement with that. But what's it really doing to us? Help us understand how unusual the modern situation is with regard to these ubiquitous distractions.
Well, I think incredibly important. And I first came across this through the 17th century mathematician and apologist Blaise Pascal. And he calls it diversions. In other words, we build around ourselves busy, entertaining distractions. So we're so focused on them, we don't have to think ultimately. And certainly we don't think about the ultimate things like the fact we're all going to die. And no philosophy of life is really adequate unless you put in things like life and death at the end in the picture. So modern teenagers, I was amused by this, are often described as screen agers because with their triple screen gazing, they're living in an incredibly small world. And the wider, deeper, wonder-filled reality is something beyond many of them. I saw a cartoon last week. Someone was asking, how do you tell the difference between a scarecrow and a human? Two birds saying. Oh, they said, the other blackbird said, that's very easy. The scarecrow doesn't have a cell phone in his hand.
Yeah. And that's the thing, too. We've become so distracted that we're getting distracted from our distractions at this point. I remember there was one moment years ago when I was using a social media app, and then I opened a browser in another device to look at the same social media page, and I realized, what am I doing? This is like distraction squared at this point. It's the exact same thing. I'm going to it again. And that's in itself, that's kind of a realization. I won't rise to call it a signal of transcendence, but it is a signal of my own distraction, right? It's a signal of just how much I'm not paying attention and how much I'm anesthetizing myself. And you get the sense of the full impact of this, I think, when you go without for a while, when you cleanse yourself of the impulse to flee to distraction, and you begin to think real thoughts. You begin to have real, long, internal processing, and you observe the world around you, and you read a text deeply, or you contemplate on scripture, or you listen to a piece of music well, with no distractions. You begin to encounter realities that you had sort of forgotten, or you stop looking at it and listening to it and thinking, how would this person react? Or how would that group characterize this? And you start to actually ask, oh, is this beautiful? Is this good? And why are the hairs on my arms rising right now? Because you're experiencing it for real without the distractions. I don't think we're fully aware of the anesthesia we're pumping into our veins spiritually with, not just screens and devices, but the constant noise that attends them. Just paying too close attention to the news cycle throughout the day can have that same deadening effect.
No, I agree with you thoroughly. And part of what I hope the book will do is give people permission to listen to the promptings of life. A friend of mine, the story I have there of Kenneth Clark and how he was in Florence, and he was just overcome by the beauty of a painting. And he said, it was as if I felt the finger of God. And my friend gave a group of CEOs that passage. He thought, well, no one will relate to that. They're all hard-bitten CEOs and so on. Everyone except one in a group of 30 said they'd had their own equivalent, but they'd been so busy, they'd, as it were, brushed it aside in the same way that Kenneth Clark did at that time.
Do you find that in the course of writing this and then talking with folks about it, that people instinctively know what you mean when you speak of a signal of transcendence? It sounds like others have this experience and they recognize it even in the stories as you tell them.
I think that's right. And the book is actually only out officially this week. But I've been delighted with people who've ordered 20 or so copies to give to their friends, because the stories speak much deeper than arguments. I have books that are arguments. Arguments are important. And this is in some ways a companion to my other book, The Great Quest, which is a description, a rational description of how a seeker moves along towards faith. But that's an argument, whereas this speaks much more directly and beautifully because it's stories.
Well, of course, one of the stories of a signal of transcendence that changed a life in here is C.S. Lewis. And I know many of my listeners will already know kind of the outlines of his story, especially if they have seen Max McLean's movie, The Most Reluctant Convert, based on his stage production about Lewis's own conversion, based itself on his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. But of course, Lewis's journey begins in a way with one of these or several of these signals of transcendence, the joy that he felt that surprised him, as the title says, in extremely simple things, like a little garden that his brother gives him as a child in a cookie tin, or thinking that perhaps he saw a fairy on the garden walk in his own sort of backyard, or the delight in Norse mythology and the music that expresses it, Wagner, those kinds of things, the northernness. He's just drawn in. But then, of course, Lewis's life becomes very full of rational argument after that. He presents his own conversion in terms of signal and then pursuit as he works through the arguments. And he tells this story in the autobiography, and in many ways he leads you through the same arguments in Mere Christianity. But the point I draw from that is that the signals aren't enough. The signals are just a beginning. They're a starting point. They're an entrance into real contemplation of the transcendent. You can't just dwell on them. And in fact, you can ignore them. Help us understand the role they play, what their limits are, and then what happens if we listen versus if we refuse to seek after those signals.
Well, in my earlier book, The Great Quest, and this is the companion, the signals fit in as stage one in the search. Stage one is a time for questions. It's questions which constitute the searcher, the seeker. Until someone really has deep existential questions, they're satisfied with whatever they believe, and it's very hard to argue with them. But when life becomes a question, then they set out. And the signals of transcendence are one of the deepest ways in which that questioning starts. But you're absolutely right. That's only stage one. Stage two, you've got to look for an answer. Stage three, you've got to look, is that answer in fact true? And stage four, you've got to get to the point of a personal commitment. But the key one is stage one. And so many people are not moving because they've never been struck or thought deeply enough to really have questions. So a very important stage, but not the whole journey in itself.
When we speak of these signals coming to us, there's almost an implied agency. It's almost as if God is actually kind of throwing these out there in our path to just trip us up and make us notice things we hadn't noticed before. But I wonder how it is you think of this. Do you think of the signals of transcendence as almost miraculous or providential events that God actually kind of puts out in front of us? Or do you think of just moments of them as just moments when, a chink opens up in our lived armor, our skepticism, and we see things that have always been there as they really are? Or is that just a false dilemma?
No, I think the latter. I think you described it well. In other words, you can see them as God's direct supernatural breaking in, or you can see them, and they also have this, as ways people realize that their human ways of figuring things out just weren't adequate. So Lewis is surprised by joy. He knew immediately it wasn't pleasure. Pleasure is only the senses. It wasn't happiness. Happiness is circumstances. It was joy which went beyond pleasure, beyond happiness. An unsatisfied desire more desirable than any satisfaction. In other words, his atheist understandings of it just didn't fit, didn't work. He had to go deeper, and so he sets off as a seeker. So I think you can see it either way. I certainly do see it as the Lord breaking in, though.
Yeah, it almost is not dangerous, but presumptuous to sort of attribute God's direct action to this or that moment. But it seems like when it happens to us, it fits so well within the providential story that God has been writing in our lives that we just recognize it. We recognize the child, saying, "Take up and read," as a divine signal, as a moment when God is actually telling us something, whereas, what the child was saying probably had nothing to do with taking up and reading the Bible. But that's the power of God.
But your point is important because there's no one signal that will speak to everyone. People have to be open to whatever it is that life says to them and the Lord says to them. But equally, when you have a signal and something's really speaking to you deeply, you can brush it off. And the story of Kenneth Clark's exactly that. He had an incredible experience in studying art of inspiration. And then in Florence, as he said, I felt the finger of God, which, as you know, is the verse that comes in Exodus when the Egyptian sorcerers, they couldn't produce the gnats that the Lord produced. They felt the finger of God, and that was quite beyond their command. But, as we know from Clark's story, at that stage in his life, he brushed it off. He was pretty honest. He said, if I went back to London, people would think I was a crackpot. He said, even worse, we now know he had mistresses. If he went back to London, having met the Lord, he'd have to put that right morally, and he didn't want to. So he felt the finger of God, and it lasted, he said, for several months. But he brushed it off. But thank God, with the rest of the story in the book, towards the end of his life, he came back.
Do you think these signals point to, in a sense, an innate knowledge that we are always suppressing? or are they actually helping us discover something we didn't know before? Obviously, sin plays into this, right? We're suppressing the truth. But what are your thoughts on that? Do we know more than we let on, or we let ourselves believe?
Well, you put that so brilliant in the introduction. I think that's what you see. Paul says in Romans 1, when he says that people hold the truth in unrighteousness. You could say they hold truth hostage. Now, my wife was in an attempted hijacking with Black Panthers. But if you have hijackers who put a pistol to the head of a pilot, the plane's supposed to go from D.C. to Los Angeles, in my wife's case, and they wanted to fly it to Algeria. In other words, you can suppress the truth and hijack it in your own directions to your own purposes. And so these signals are saying, no, you can't. There's more to life than you're admitting, and it leads in a different direction. Think.
Well, that's a good reminder, actually, that these signals don't have to always be positive. They don't always have to be a sunset or a flower or a symphony. They can actually be very negative too. And I want to touch on that with Malcolm Muggeridge's story in particular. But when you say that the signals of transcendence can strike us at any time and they're unique for everyone, we're not just talking about pretty sunsets here. We are talking about something that could be a terrifying reality, a terrifying inbreaking. Kind of help us understand that so that we've got our minds in the right place as we encounter these stories.
Well, two of the stories to me are still moving to me now. One is W.H. Auden, the great 20th century English poet. When he left Oxford a few years afterwards, he was young, left-wing, atheist, and gay at a time when it was not popular. And he was a hero of people on the left and fought against Franco in the Spanish Civil War. So he comes over to America to escape that with his gay partner. And of course, in 1939, there's no television. So you have to go to the cinema on a Saturday night to watch the latest round of the documentary news. And unbeknownst to him, the audience in the cinema he went to in the Upper East Side of Manhattan was almost all German in Yorkville. And of course, America was neutral. The war had broken out in Europe. The Brits supported Britain, and the Germans supported Germany. And one night, he went and the documentary was on the siege of Poland. And Nazi stormtroopers were bayoneting women and children brutally. But the German audience in the cinema cried out, kill them, egging on their own fellow countrymen. And Auden sat there in the darkness, horrified. He says in 2 minutes, his whole worldview was overturned. First, he knew there was radical evil. He'd always thought humans were basically good. Little better psychology, politics, education, we'd turn out well. No. He knew humans had evil. But worse, he needed an absolute to say Hitler was absolutely wrong, not relatively. Not just culturally, because we in the English-speaking world are different from the Germans in the German-speaking world. No, that's relative. He knew there had to be an absolute, but only the funny old fundamentalists believed in absolutes. Intellectuals like him, they didn't. So he said, I left the cinema a seeker after an unconditional absolute and met Jesus. That passion for an absolute to judge what was absolutely evil was the signal for him.
Isn't that remarkable that evil itself, even something so just horrifying as watching ordinary men and women become hateful to the point where they want civilians to be killed, right? That can serve as a signal of transcendence. There are some people who respond to that in a way, and then there are some people who just don't seem interested in responding to it. So I think of two contrasting cases. One is Jordan Peterson, who's obviously in process, still very much alive and with us and receiving the prayers of many people, I know. He, in his first popular book, 12 Rules for Life, he talks about his reading about the Soviet atrocities, right, in the gulags, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's experiences. And he speaks of evil as so obvious and so real that there must be something that condemns it. that there must be a standard that it's violating. And so he almost reasons his way backward from absolute evil, or, as black as humans can paint morally, to absolute good, because otherwise you can't tell the difference between them. So it's like he's taking that signal of transcendence. Someone who didn't seem to have heeded the signal was H.G. Wells. And I'm reading Christopher Watkins' book, Biblical Critical Theory, and he has these two just, chilling quotes from Wells from before World War II and after World War II. And so the first one, he says essentially, mankind is obviously on the pathway, despite the First World War, I guess he's ignoring that. Mankind is obviously on the pathway to endless success. We're going to conquer nature. We're going to conquer all our problems. The wickedness of the past is going to be undone with education and so forth. The typical like atheist mentality. And then he gets to the end of the war and he says something entirely different. It's a 180 reversal. He says, we've just seen such, I'm paraphrasing, we've just seen such horrors unleashed upon the world that any thought that humans are perfectible by education or good government or whatever should be utterly scorned and laughed out of the room. And he says, I confess my spirit was almost entirely broken by what I saw. And that there's a signal there. It's a negative signal, but you have to heed it. You have to recognize that if evil is real, there must be something more. Instead of just losing hope and, I guess, despairing.
Yeah, and of course his final book was Mind at the End of Its Tether, which was indeed despairing. And you think of people like William Golding, who again saw the point of evil very clearly in World War II, and then wrote his famous Lord of the Flies, because he realized it wasn't just in Nazi death camps. You had the same problems in English boarding schools for the upper class wealthy people. The kids were as bad too, and so on. But I love the story, one of the others, of Philip Halley, who was a Jewish scholar who'd majored on all the horror of the Nazi scientific experiments and so on, cutting off fingers of children without anesthetics. Anyway, after a lifetime both fighting against Germany in the war and then studying it for himself, he was depressed to the point of ready to take his life. And sitting in his study, all these books on the horror of it all, he looked at some books on the resistance and just pulled out a pamphlet he'd never read. And it was the story of the little village, the Huguenot village Le Chambon, in southwest France, where they'd rescued 5,000 Jewish children. Halley, of course, is Jewish himself. And he says, after reading this story, which he'd never read before, he thought he had something in his eye. Was it a fly? It was a tear. He said the goodness of these people in the midst of the horror of the darkness was a heart-cracking goodness. And I love that. So evil certainly reduces us to tears, but actually goodness, love, can reduce us in a deeper way in the contrast to evil.
I love that. I'm talking today with Os Guinness about his new book, Signals of Transcendence, Listening to the Promptings of Life. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this. Hi, this is Shane Morris. Suicide has become an epidemic, and the church has a vital role to play in fighting against it. Our next Lighthouse Voices event on September 5th will help you better understand what that role looks like. Our speaker for this event is Dr. Matthew Sleeth, author of Hope Always, How to Be a Force for Life in a Culture of Suicide. He'll help us understand what's behind the current epidemic and what Christians can do to fight suicide and care for those who are struggling. Tickets are available for both in-person and online attendance. You can register today at colsoncenter.org/lighthousevoices. We're back on Upstream talking with Os Guinness about his new book, Signals of Transcendence, Listening to the Promptings of Life. Dr. Guinness, this is really a book of stories, first and foremost, and you've mentioned several of them. You've got figures like Malcolm Muggeridge, Peter Berger, you mentioned W.H. Auden, Philip Halley, G.K. Chesterton, and the list goes on and on. Each has their own experience of a signal of transcendence. I want to know how you made your selections of these 10, because even as we're even as I'm reading it here, I'm thinking of additional examples. And even Augustine, like we said earlier, is a kind of an obvious example of a signal of transcendence. What was your selection process like?
Well, I just wanted to have a reasonably diverse, because obviously I was concerned mostly with people in the modern world. So people, say, in Africa or Asia, they don't need that awakening from the secular cave that we need in the West. And so I was trying to think of people whose stories would speak to people that I know well, the sort of self-satisfied atheist, materialist, and so on.
That makes a lot of sense. And it speaks to the, I guess, particular handicap that we face in the West, that we're not looking at in the modern West, we're not looking at the world the way most people have always looked at it, expecting there to be transcendence, expecting there to be more than just matter. And it on this front, I can't help thinking that we are really the victims of a diabolical plot. And C.S. Lewis even talks about this and sort of floats this idea in the Screwtape Letters, where Screwtape remarks that in certain eras, we have different policies. And in the modern West, our policy currently is to make people into atheists and agnostics and materialists. And one of the things we have to do to bring that about is to limit our own spiritual terrorism and interference, because if the demons got too involved in terrorizing humans, then humans would begin to think, well, maybe there's more than just matter in motion. But of course, in other civilizations, they have no qualms about direct terrorism. But the side effect, as he pointed out, is that people turn to God very readily, because it's a reminder that there is more going on than just matter.
Now, Max Weber talked about modern secular society as the disenchantment of the West, the cutting off of the sense of the real and the unseen. Lewis talked about the re-enchantment, which is good, but the trouble is people think, well, just by stories and imagination, we're creating something which isn't actually true. And the point is, I think the signals remind people, yes, these things are true, and we've been blind to them. We've stifled them, repressed them.
I look at God's providence in my own life, and there are moments when it strikes me very clearly, even in little things. And just this week, Dr. Guinness, the way it struck me was that I've read most of what C.S. Lewis wrote, but somehow I had managed to skip over talking about bicycles, his little essay on the 4 stages of, enchantment. And it's exactly what you're saying. In the first stage, we're unenchanted. We don't know what a bicycle is. The second stage, we're enchanted. The bicycle becomes this magical object that gives us freedom and power and speed. And we just think our lives will never be the same as kids when we first ride a bicycle. And then we become disenchanted. We think, oh, it's just a bike. It's just a way to get to school. But there's a 4th stage that we must never forget. And that I think a lot of Western people are coming back around to as we tire of the drabness and soul-crushing inadequacy of materialism. And that is the re-enchantment phase, as we realize there really was something amazing there. There really was something magical. But the key to holding on to it is to recognize that the bicycle, the proverbial bicycle, is not ultimate. That in order to experience that joy again, that freedom, we have to look past the bicycle, as it were. This goes to meditation in a tool shed. It's similar theme there. But yeah, we're trying to coax people into that 4th stage. And I think a lot of the stories in this book can make that happen for folks.
Now, you put it in terms of Plato's cave. We need a mass breakout.
Okay, so I want to zero in on some of the stories here. We'll start with Peter Berger, who actually came up with the term signals of transcendence. And this one really touched me, because right now I'm the father of a 10-month-old. She's the youngest of 4. My oldest is a 10-year-old. But I see frequently the reminders of the beauty of a mother's love, of her reassurance to her child, of saying that everything is all right, of calming Aubrey and telling her, Mommy's here. And mothers have a special way with children. They have a special way of doing that. I like to think that Aubrey and I have a special relationship. There's that daddy-daughter dynamic. And often she wants to come to me. But boy, when when things are bad or scary or uncomfortable, or you have a tummy ache, there's something about mommy. Just never, she can never be replaced. So he comes up with this term, signals of transcendence, and he speaks of a mother's assurance to her child. as one of those signals. That's beautiful. Can you tell us that story and why you included it?
Well, I found it very moving too. It's actually one of the first ones that Berger has in his own book, A Rumor of Angels. And he points out the idea, nothing is more prototypical, profoundly comforting. Everything's going to be all right. And Berger says, wait a minute, is that true? Is the mother, in fact, lying? Because a lot of things in this life are not all right. And one day, both the child and the mother are going to die. And then he starts unpacking what the intuitive comfort really means, and what would have to be true if that love, which is instinctive, really addresses the reality of the universe, or whether it's all a fiction. Now, Berger was very good at that.
Right, because if the assurance is everything is going to be all right tonight, you're safe, you're warm, you're fed, but eventually we're both going to die and disappear into the indifferent darkness of the universe, right? Eventually, destruction and evil and power plays will win out. Eventually, the death camps of the world will triumph. Eventually, mankind will just destroy itself in a nuclear holocaust. Just all these plausible outcomes on a secular outlook make what the mother tells her child a lie. And that noticing the significance of that is that's a really astute observation. But of course, you as a Christian, you don't believe that everything is going to be all right, everything is in order, is a lie. There's actually an ultimate resonance with the mother's reassurance that the universe does have a point. It does have a telos, and there is a God orchestrating everything, a good God.
No, I love that because in my own experiences, you know, Shane, I was born in China. And our family went through a terrible famine in which 5 million died in 3 months, including my 2 brothers. And my father, he always said the hardest thing of leaving China was leaving those 2 little graves behind. So on the one hand, it was heartbreaking to lose their 2 sons. But on the other hand, although you had revolution and war and disease, death and destruction all around, they could still believe that the final order of the universe was good. God was in control, and one day all will be well. So I always summarize what my father taught me in those days. God is greater than all. God can be trusted in all situations. Have no fear. Have faith in God. And that wasn't make-believe, because in our Christian worldview, that is the reality of what the world truly is, beyond all the immediate death and destruction. So that particular story means the world to me.
That's a great segue to talk about your grandfather, Whitfield Guinness, who is another one of the stories in the book. Tell us about his love for your grandmother and why that shines through as a signal of transcendence.
Well, I've got to be very clear that in their case, my grandparents, they were believers. In other words, all the other stories in the book are people who were not Christian believers at all, but prompted by the signal to search. My grandparents were. In fact, they were missionaries to China, and they went through incredible experiences there, part of which I tell in the book. But they had an amazing love, having gone through the hellfire of the Boxer Rebellion and nearly died several times. And so I'm very moved. We have here, not very far from me now, I have a Christmas card that my grandfather, then in his 20s, gave to his new wife on their first Christmas. And it just reads simply in his writing, and we don't know whether it's original to him or a copy of some other quotation, "To one who is dearer than life, with a love that is stronger than death." And I love it because they came to know the meaning of love through the intensity of incredible suffering and the danger that they went through in the Boxer riots in China, nearly dying several times. So I love the simple fact, you take the pop song, if love is not forever, what's forever for? Someone who truly loves knows that it's not some ephemeral emotions coming and going. It demands and requires eternity, and so on. So I love that particular one. I've tried to express how love is so deeply meaningful in that chapter to me and to my grandparents.
What do you mean when you say that love requires or demands eternity?
Well, you think of someone in love, and you know the cliches, the grass is greener, the sky is bluer, and all that. But one of the deepest things is that you know whatever you're feeling now is so incredible, it must go on forever. And mortality, death, is an insult to what you're feeling now. Surely it transcends that. And of course it does, because it points to someone higher than our life with its transience and finiteness, to the Lord who is the source of love and eternity. You know, Nietzsche, talking about joy in C.S. Lewis, joy wills eternity, deep, deep eternity. Now, I don't think Nietzsche followed up the way that Lewis did, but I think the same is true of love. Love wills eternity, deep, deep eternity. What you're feeling, you know, demands to be far more than you're experiencing in the immediate moment.
You bring up Lewis again, and I can't help but thinking of an experience I had while reading this book of just something in Lewis clicked for me for the first time. So you're telling the parable of Plato's cave from the Republic, right? And for the first time, I recognized that Lewis is retelling that parable with a little twist at the end of the last battle with the dwarves in the stable, where they're refusing to see the real world around them, but those who have seen the light, seen the reality of the true Narnia, are trying to drag them out of their imaginary cave, as it were, and getting them to look at the beauty around them, the reality, and they won't see it. They think, you guys are crazy. You guys are just trying to trick us. We're going to stay in here. I totally didn't realize he's doing a Plato riff there, but of course, yeah, Lewis is always saying it's all in Plato. What do they teach in these schools? I want to talk about G.K. Chesterton here while we still got a few minutes. He is one of my favorites in the book, and he is someone whose writing I've only really dove into in the last year and a half, 2 years. So I've read both of his big, well-known books, Orthodoxy and The Everlasting Man, and had guests talk about them on Upstream. But he was arrested by a very commonplace signal of transcendence. In fact, it was a dandelion. Could you tell us that story and then explain how it helped push Chesterton to become the writer we know?
Well, I love Chesterton too. On my other wall, I have the autograph of C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton, and the flourish of his autograph is like the flourish of his writing. But you know, when he left school, he didn't go to Oxford and Cambridge like most of his peers. He was very artistic, and he went to the Slade School of Art in London. But it was very close to what you call postmodern today. Cynical, debunking, nihilistic, and he even, as he said, flirted with the occult. So his worldview was incredibly dark. But as he was thinking of all this, he said, I was stopped in my tracks by a dandelion, not a rose or sunset on the beach with a margarita in your hand or the birth of a baby, a dandelion, a little weed. And he is saying, no, the world is broken. You can see the ruin and brokenness of the world very easily. But even a simple thing like the dandelion reminds us it's still wonderful. There's beauty as well as brokenness. And then he says, how do you bring the two together? Which philosophy of life helps you to explain both the brokenness and the beauty? And of course, you read Orthodoxy, that incredible passage where it's almost like Archimedes shouting, Eureka! He suddenly sees all the things fit together, bolt after bolt. They all fit together. And the prose is incredibly exciting because he sees that the Christian faith explains both the brokenness, because of sin, and the beauty, because of God's creation. But it's the little dandelion that sets him off.
This is the thing that signals us that Christianity is the answer to the transcendent longings we're looking for, is precisely its ability to explain both the brokenness and the beauty. So Chesterton talks about how this key moment he notices, and this is in Orthodoxy, if I remember correctly, this key moment where he notices that the critics of Christianity are always criticizing it for opposite complaints. So, Christianity is too airy-fairy, but it's also too dark and pessimistic. Christianity is too enchanted with the life of the ordinary people, but it's too dependent on the exalted and rich people and the bishops and all their finery and so forth. It's like it almost appears as if, number one, they're going to criticize Christianity no matter what because they're committed to doing so, and number two, that Christianity is seeing around all of these false dilemmas in a way that actually encompasses the whole picture, that embraces reality in a way that humans are very hesitant to do because we're small-minded and we like to set up oppositions where there don't need to be oppositions. But that in itself is a kind of signal that says something more is going on here, something bigger that bursts your categories apart.
No, I love that. My own word for it is the Christian faith is bifocal. It sees all the beauty because of this incredible world of wonder in diversity and beauty that the Lord has created. And yet you look at the ruin of sin, and you've got to be able to explain both, and the Bible does both. It's bifocal.
We've got a couple of lesser-known stories in here, and we have time for one more. I want to hear about Windsor Elliott and the little cheetah, because that one was interesting to me. She's not a very well-known character, and yet there's a signal of transcendence here and an illustration of how powerful something very simple, a simple realization can be in the life of someone who's just ignoring God.
Well, she's a Californian student who started to model on a whim and rocketed from San Francisco to Toronto to Paris to New York, and was a Ford model on the front cover of Vogue, and at the grand old age of 19-20 was engaged to a French baron who was the same age, wealthy, handsome, and they would have an incredible life, New York, Paris, every weekend. And he was a friend of people like the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Pablo Picasso, Salvador Dali, and so the world was her oyster, put it mildly. But one weekend, they were at a party in the Hotel Maurice put on by Salvador Dali, the great surrealist painting. And it was really ground zero for surrealism. And in the middle of the party, chained to the table, was Dali's pet cheetah, a painted leopard or a little ocelot, technically. And Windsor was looking at this incredible animal, lithe, beautiful, muscular, pacing in and out among the guests. It had been declawed, defanged, de-everything. And suddenly, she said, it was like it was a caricature of what it was supposed to be. And then she looked at the people. Men with their gold-encrusted Nero jackets, and the women with antlers in their hair, bejeweled, believe it. I mean, it was an incredible world. And suddenly it was like an abyss opening up. We, she thought, were a caricature of what we were supposed to be. She said, I've got to search for the meaning of life. This world of high fashion is so incredibly hollow. Something's deeply wrong. And she became a seeker. Now, in her case, 2 years on, people at Vogue directed her to mediums and all sorts of disastrous things. She wasn't a Christian. She'd been an atheist. She knew no better. And walking up Park Avenue one night, she prayed, having got nowhere. God, if you're there, I can't find you. You'll have to find me. And I don't actually tell the end of the story in the book because there's not time. But it was 6 months later that her mother, whom she didn't appreciate, was living with her, dying of cancer. And friends came in to visit her mother. And one day her mother was showing these friends her portfolio of all her modeling photographs. And the friends gasped. And Windsor said, why did you gasp? And they said, we're Christians. And 6 months ago, that was the very time she'd prayed that prayer, we were going to a prayer meeting in Seattle, and we were getting coffee for the group. And as we walked out of the checkout, the Holy Spirit said to us, pray for the girl on the front of that magazine. And they bought the magazine, put it down. Everyone had prayed for them. They'd prayed every single day. And that was Windsor. So her signal of transcendence was the little leopard. But she had then become a seeker and reached out to the Lord, and the Lord had found her.
I love that. My last question here is kind of a two-parter. I want to know how we can better listen for these signals of transcendence. You speak at the end of every chapter of those who have ears being ready to listen, that they should listen. Of course, that's borrowing Jesus' phrasing there. So how can we become better listeners? And then how can we better act on a signal of transcendence when we receive it? What do we do?
My wife is at the moment up in Long Island, in a place she loves compared with Washington, D.C. Everything in D.C. is politics and man-made, artificial. Long Island, the ocean, the beaches, and so on, a world of wonder. So I think all of us, we've got to break out of the man-made, the triple screen gazing and all that sort of thing. And as we can, make sure we live more of our lives in the beauty of the nature all around us. That's one thing. But then when these things strike us, we've got to take the time, think enough, care enough to really think through what it is, maybe share with a friend and wrestle with them until we come to an answer. In other words, not just brush them off. Interesting experience, on we go. No. When life gives us these signals, we want to follow through with them until we have answers that are deeply satisfactory to the best of our hearts and our minds together.
So don't be satisfied until we've found what it is we're seeking.
Indeed. And I end this book like I end the previous one, The Great Quest, with that wonderful prayer of St. Augustine. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. The signals are life's prompting that remind us that we're restless until we find a deep and satisfying answer.
Couldn't agree more. Beautiful. My guest today has been Os Guinness, author of many excellent books, but most recently, Signals of Transcendence, Listening to the Promptings of Life. Dr. Os Guinness, thanks so much for joining me again on the program. This was an honor.
Thank you, Shane. Always a privilege.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media and find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.